Okay, last review of the show is going to be Path of Relics, Aether, the Lore Seeker Odyssey book number 1, written by DJ Lejeune. It is 449 pages, $4.99. It's available on Kindle Unlimited, and here's the author's description. You enter the contest to win cash. Now millions can nine. Random gigs and ramen noodles, that's how the out-of-shape gamer Terry survives the job star future of 2044. Until he's accepted into the Path of Relics tournament, the most anticipated virtual reality RPG event of the decade, where he has a chance to win some real loot. But does he have a fighting chance against the world's top active VR athletes? Not to mention the ancient dungeons, puzzles, scorpion wolves, and all too realistic NPCs the game world throws at him. And just how advanced is this portal rig that lets him physically experience the fantasy world as if he were transported there? Worse, could his suspicions be true? Are the strange and deadly malfunctions plaguing Manhattan somehow triggered by Path of Relics? Now, outmatched and exhausted, can Terry's mysterious ability to level up quickly and his meager martial arts skills help him avert catastrophe in the real world? And that, folks, is a very accurate description of the story. You notice there is this distinct lack of this is an RPG with lots of crunchy numbers and classes and stuff. The story, I would say, very light on the RPG mechanics. We'll get into it a little bit. But it's mostly like a VR, I don't want to say quite cyberpunk story, although there are cyberpunk elements, but it's mostly just a competitive VR game story. So it is what it is. For me, I'll say that start off, the writing in the story isn't bad at all. Good, fine stuff there. No technical issues. There's a good bit load of front-loaded world building that was done rather well. I felt for the main character in a world that were a lot of people put out to work because of an advanced AI taking over jobs of every sort. And so that was really set up very well. It only kind of leads as a setup for why people would be risking a lot of time in the world. Doesn't end up being like a super huge element of the story, more like just a good bit of backstory and why the main character is even interested in this game in the first place. And once in the game, though, combat is pretty good when it appears, and there is a variety of game puzzles that stretch out the questline. However, overall, story honestly doesn't work for me. And even in the author's advertisements on Facebook, I recall seeing the author saying this story isn't for everybody, and that kind of summarizes what I thought about story as I finished it up. Yeah, this doesn't work for me. This isn't really for me. There's really super light RPG mechanics, and if you took them out of the story, it really wouldn't change much. And that's mostly because once you get into the game, or once you get into the VR MMO side of things, all the level progression is fairly automatic. The main character is not choosing how to distribute stats. He's not choosing how to advance class things at all. He's not getting a bunch of options and choosing them. All that stuff is fairly automatic. So the RPG progression stuff feels relatively on rails. Nobody's really making a choice here. And the main character getting an advancement of leveling very quickly feels artificially forced. There's hundreds of professional video game players, and it's only the main character that figures out how to level up quickly by playing the actual game instead of just participating in the tournament that the game developers are setting up. It always felt the main character has this weird advantage for no reason whatsoever, even though he's not a particularly amazing gamer. He's the only one who figured out, play the actual MMO and you'll level up faster, or, whatever advantages he's on. I won't spoil too much into the story or the RPG mechanics, but it always felt as a forced way of making him advance to me a little bit. Story-wise, that kind of reflects in what the story is as well. It felt like the author was trying to bring in too many elements. It is a Hunger Games style competition setup where the main character who's out of work or he's doing these various gigs gets an opportunity to participate in this super advanced virtual reality game that's almost indistinguishable from reality because of the VR rig he uses, which is completely necessary for the story, but exists, and it affects him in real life because they're actually exercising and moving when they're moving in the game. And if he doesn't do well in tournament, he'll just be kicked out and to lose his opportunity to convert the game he gets in game to real life money. And it's voted upon. It's like live streamed. Every element of his gameplay will be live streamed, and viewers will vote. So there's like this almost Hunger Games element of like, oh, if you don't perform well, you're going to get kicked off this game and you're just going to lose. And that's supposed to be kind of the setup for why he'd be interested in, or why other characters are interested in doing this at all. And it just didn't really make sense to me, because it started out as this PvP tournament thing, right? And the main character is not a great PvP player. Like, they're, again, professional VR gamers that make their living on this, and he's going up against them, but somehow he kind of wins because he discovers, that playing the game actually gets him levels, and nobody else figures it out for some weird reason. And so the story really does shift from that tournament thing, which is really pumped up a lot in the early story, to just following the main character as he essentially abandons that and goes and follows quest lines in this VR MMO game, and they're completely fantasy. It's a lot of puzzle stuff and avoiding enemies and combat things, and again, not a poorly told story, but it is a different kind of storytelling from, oh, this is going to be PvP tournament stuff, which is what it was set up as. Then going on to the VR MMO RPG quest lining stuff. And then after that, towards the middle end of the story, oh, now it's going to be a cyberpunk theme because things that are happening in the game are affecting real life. And none of this is really like a surprise. Reading like the very first chapter in the story, it's like, oh, somebody completes something of the game and it unlocks the levees for this town and the entire city floods. And, the main character going through his story is like, oh, happens to notice all these things are happening here. And again, for me as a reader, it stretches incredulity that nobody else in this world noticed that these game creatures are appearing here in the real world as like holograms stopping, automated car stuff, or that, the local nuclear power plant has been taken over. Like there are scenes in the show where it's like, oh yeah, there's really an AI intrusion here, but we're not going to report it because our efficiency in our plant is better. So we're just not going to talk about this, or, other things like that, like the events. And this is just a way for the other to show, oh, the things happening in the game are somehow affecting real life. And nobody except the main character notices. Like in a world where AI is everywhere, none of these AIs is reporting or noticing that there's an intrusion into their systems, in these supposedly very secure systems. But it's just, for me, it's like, oh, that I get what you're doing. It becomes slightly unbelievable for me, and that aspect of the story just didn't work either. And it's just, each one of these elements kind of comes in and they don't really necessarily fit each other, especially when and this is a thing for me in particular, anytime like these real world events are there and the author seems to kind of force that, oh, the only way we can fix this cyberpunk thing happening is for you to go back into the game and finish it and and stop these things from happening in the game. It always feels super forced that element occurs, and that's kind of what happens here in this story. It's like, oh, all these terrible things, we're all abandoning this areas because these things are happening. Oh no, but the main character's like, I have to go back in the game. I can stop it. I can at least distract the AI from continuing to do things, or figure a way to stop them from the inside. And that's a very cyberpunk kind of concept of like, oh, using the system to stop the AI. That's super cyberpunk, and that kind of works sometimes. In this case, it didn't work for me. So it's just these elements felt like a huge stretch for me. So for me, it is like drew down my enjoyment of the story. Talked about the RPGs already. Overall, it was a struggle for me. Like this story, the beginning was again well developed enough. I was like, okay, I'll go along for this ride for a little bit. But once we got to the actual game stuff, and I saw that the RPG elements, although again they do exist, this isn't a little bitty story, really weren't particularly. There's not a lot of like player dissection of like what class should I take? How I distribute stats? What's the information? What's the difference? How's that going to change things? The main character gets new powers and abilities from like scrolls he gets from in game. But again, it felt very like those elements were already chosen for the main character to some degree or another because he needed to advance in a certain way, or he needed to, he's getting these huge level gains for particular game reasons. And it felt forced because he wasn't making a lot of decisions on the RPG side of things. On the other story elements, he definitely did. He chose to go different paths or follow quest lines or keep NPC characters, and that's all fine. But the RPG stuff didn't really feel like it mattered a ton to me, at least. And so it didn't keep my interest, and I kind of had to force myself to continue throughout the story. And so other people like the story for what it is. They really do. Like there are plenty of good positive reviews here. It's just for me, I'm like, yeah, the author is right. It's not for everybody. Like RPG elements are super, super duper light, and to some degree, like they exist and they blend well with the story, but like, oh, okay, these could have been, you can take a lot of it out and it wouldn't really affect the plotline, because a lot of the plotline revolves around eventually the cyberpunk elements and the actual quest lines of the main character traveling through these VR worlds. So it's definitely more of a VR competition game that turns into a VR quest line and the cyberpunk elements. And sprinkled in there are some fairly regular RPG level ups with like stats that increase on a regular basis. But again, there's not a lot of theorizing about classes or builds or actual choices from the main character to develop a certain play style or stat line. All that's automatic. So for me, it wasn't really satisfying in that respect. So for Path of Relics, Aether Shard, the Lore Seeker Odyssey book number 1, you're going to give it a 6 out of 10. Again, not a bad review score. This is not a bad book, or it's not even boring. It's not even not boring, rather. It just didn't work for me, mostly because of the RPG elements. So that's Path of Relics, Aether Shard with a score of 6 out of 10.